The reward posters had faded beneath years of sun, rain, and dust, but one name was still easy to read. Silas Vane. Wanted dead or alive. Reward, $20,000. Across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakota Territory, people spoke his name in whispers. Ranchers locked their doors before sunset. Stagecoach drivers refused to travel alone. Mothers warned their children that if they wandered too far into the hills, Silas Vane would find them first. Some claimed he had robbed more than a dozen stagecoaches. Others swore he had killed lawmen without a second thought. No one knew how many stories were true anymore. But everyone agreed on one thing. If Silas Vane was riding toward your town, trouble always rode beside him. For nearly 8 years, he had disappeared into the mountains whenever posses came searching. The best trackers failed to follow him. Experienced bounty hunters returned empty-handed, or never returned at all. To most people, Silas Vane wasn't just an outlaw. He had become a legend. Then, on a chilly October evening, something happened that no one in Willow Creek could have imagined. The church bell had just struck 6 when old Jacob Miller, the town blacksmith, looked up from his forge. A lone rider was entering town. The horse moved slowly, almost as if it were too tired to continue. Its rider sat motionless beneath a weathered black hat, his long coat covered with layers of trail dust. Jacob narrowed his eyes. Then the hammer slipped from his hand. My God! It's him! Within seconds, word spread through the streets. Silas Vane is here. Shopkeepers hurriedly locked their doors. Parents grabbed their children and pulled them inside. Deputies rushed toward the sheriff's office, loading their rifles as fear swept through the town like wildfire. Sheriff Owen Carter stepped onto the wooden porch, resting one hand on the grip of his revolver. He had hunted Silas for nearly 4 years. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times. But never like this. Silas didn't gallop into town with guns blazing. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply climbed down from his horse and stood in the middle of the empty street. Then, before anyone could react, he slowly raised both hands. I've come to surrender. The deputies stared in disbelief. One whispered, it's a trick. Another cocked his rifle. Don't move. Silas didn't even glance at the weapons pointed at him. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the small white church at the end of Main Street. From inside came the soft, trembling sound of a violin. The melody floated through the evening air, gentle, imperfect, and heartbreakingly beautiful. Silas stood perfectly still. For a brief moment, the feared outlaw looked less like a killer and more like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. Sheriff Carter cautiously approached him. Why now? He asked. You've escaped every posse in the territory. Why surrender today? Silas kept listening to the music. His voice was barely above a whisper. Because I don't have much time left. The sheriff frowned. What does that mean? Silas finally looked at him. His weathered face, scarred by years of violence and hardship, held an expression the sheriff had never expected to see. Not anger. Not fear. Regret. I'll go with you, Silas said quietly. I'll answer for everything I've done. He paused as another delicate note drifted from the church. But before you put those irons on me, I have one last request. The deputies tightened their grip on their rifles. Sheriff Carter's eyes narrowed. What request? Silas swallowed hard, never taking his eyes off the church. There's a little girl in there playing the violin. I want to hear her finish the song. The entire street fell silent. No one understood why the most feared outlaw in the American West had traded 8 years of freedom for a single melody played by a child. No one spoke. The deputies kept their rifles trained on Silas Vane as Sheriff Owen Carter searched his face for any sign of deception. But the outlaw didn't move. He simply stood in the fading evening light, listening to the violin drifting from the little white church. Finally, the sheriff gave a slow nod. 5 minutes, he said. No more. Silas reached for his gun belt. Every deputy stiffened. Instead of drawing his revolver, he unbuckled the belt and gently laid it on the dusty street. Then he removed the hunting knife hidden inside his boot, followed by a small pistol tucked beneath his coat. I won't need these anymore, he said. The sheriff stared at the pile of weapons. For the first time in nearly a decade, Silas Vane stood completely defenseless. Together, they walked toward the church. Townspeople cautiously stepped from behind doors and windows, following at a distance. No one wanted to miss what might be the final chapter of the West's most feared outlaw. Inside, the church was quiet except for the soft sound of a violin. 8-year-old Emily Harper stood near the altar. Her dress had been mended more than once, and the violin in her hands was old enough to belong in a museum. One corner was cracked, and one string had been replaced with fishing line. Yet when she played, the worn instrument sounded alive. The melody floated through the wooden chapel like a warm breeze after a long winter. Silas removed his hat. His rough hands trembled. He closed his eyes. For a moment, the years melted away. He wasn't standing in a church surrounded by deputies. He was standing in a small cabin many years earlier. A little girl with bright blue eyes laughed as she struggled to hold a tiny violin. Daddy, she giggled, listen. I almost got it right. Her name had been Anna. She practiced every evening while her mother cooked supper over the fire. Sometimes she missed every other note. Sometimes she stopped halfway through and burst into laughter. But to Silas, it had been the most beautiful music he'd ever heard. Then came the winter when sickness swept through the valley. Within 1 week, Anna was gone. Her violin sat untouched in the corner of the cabin. 2 months later, grief stole his wife as well. Silas had buried both of them with his own hands. Something inside him died that spring. He abandoned the ranch. He picked up a gun. And every year afterward, anger became easier than remembering. Until there was nothing left of the kind husband and loving father he had once been. Only the outlaw remained. A tear rolled down his weathered cheek. Sheriff Carter noticed. So it's true, he whispered. You weren't born a monster. Silas shook his head. No one is. Emily reached the final movement of the song. The last notes echoed gently beneath the church ceiling before fading into silence. She turned and finally noticed the crowd. Her eyes widened at the sight of armed deputies, and the tall stranger standing quietly among them. Instead of hiding behind her father, she smiled politely. Did you like my song, mister? Silas couldn't answer at first. His throat tightened. Finally, he nodded. It was the most beautiful thing I've heard in 20 years. Emily walked closer, holding the old violin against her chest. My mama says music helps people remember the good things. Silas gave a sad smile. It reminded me of someone I thought I'd lost forever. The music? No, he whispered. Myself. The church fell silent again. Even the deputies lowered their rifles. For the first time, no one saw the infamous outlaw whose name filled wanted posters across the frontier. They saw a broken father. A man who had spent years running from the pain he never learned to face. And everyone sensed that before the night was over, Silas Vane would make a choice that would be remembered long after the legend of the outlaw had faded. The silence inside the church lingered long after the final note had faded. 8-year-old Emily looked up at Silas with innocent curiosity. She had no idea the man standing before her was the most feared outlaw in the American West. To her, he was simply a tired traveler with tears in his eyes. She held out the old violin. Would you like to hold it? Silas hesitated. His hands, scarred by years of violence and hard living, slowly reached for the worn instrument. He cradled it carefully, as though it were made of glass. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes. It felt almost identical to the little violin his daughter Anna had once carried around their tiny ranch house. A faint smile crossed his face. "I used to tighten my daughter's strings before every lesson," he whispered. "I told her one day she'd play on the biggest stages in America." His voice broke. "But she never got the chance." Emily gently touched his sleeve. "I'm sorry." Those two simple words struck harder than any bullet ever had. For years, people had cursed his name. They had hunted him. They had feared him. But no one had simply said, "I'm sorry." Silas carefully handed the violin back to the little girl. "Promise me something." Emily nodded. "No matter what life takes from you, never let it take your kindness." "I promise." Outside, the evening sky glowed deep orange as the sun slipped behind the mountains. Sheriff Owen Carter stepped forward with the handcuffs in his hands. The crowd waited, expecting one last desperate escape. Instead, Silas turned around on his own and placed his wrists together. "I'm ready." The sheriff paused. "You know they'll probably hang you." Silas gave a peaceful nod. "I know. I should have surrendered years ago. I can't change the lives I destroyed. But maybe." He glanced toward Emily. "I can stop destroying any more." The handcuffs clicked shut. No one in the crowd celebrated. No one cheered. The only sound was the wind moving through the cottonwood trees. As the deputies escorted Silas toward the jail, nearly the entire town followed in silence. The next morning, newspapers across Montana carried an unbelievable headline. "The West's most wanted outlaw surrenders after hearing a little girl play the violin." People dismissed it as another exaggerated frontier tale. Until Sheriff Carter testified under oath that every word was true. Weeks later, Silas stood before the judge. The courtroom overflowed with reporters, ranchers, deputies, and curious townspeople. The judge asked the customary question. "Do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Silas slowly stood. For a long moment, he looked around the crowded courtroom. "I've spent years blaming the world for my pain. I thought revenge would quiet the grief. It never did. It only buried the man my wife and daughter once loved." He turned toward Emily and her parents, who sat quietly in the front row. "That little girl's music didn't save my life. It reminded me that I still had a soul worth answering for." The courtroom remained silent. Even seasoned reporters stopped writing. The judge removed his glasses. "I've sentenced many dangerous men," he said quietly. "But today, I believe I'm sentencing a man who finally found the courage to face himself." Years passed. Emily Harper grew into one of the finest violinists in the country, performing in concert halls from Chicago to New York. Yet before every major performance, she told the same story. She would hold up her old violin and say, "When I was 8 years old, I played a simple song in a small Montana church. I thought I was practicing alone. I didn't know a broken man was listening. That day taught me something I'll never forget. Music can't erase the past. But it can open a door that anger never could." Visitors still came to Willow Creek long after the old frontier disappeared. They stopped at the little white church where a small wooden plaque rested beside the front pew. It read, "In this place, a single melody accomplished what bullets, prisons, and bounty hunters never could." It reminded one lost soul that redemption begins with a single choice. And whenever the wind swept through the valley, the townspeople liked to believe they could still hear the faint echo of a violin, a reminder that sometimes the strongest force in the world isn't fear. It's compassion.